"Your brother needs this more than you do," my mother said, refilling her wine glass without even looking at me. "Consider the house a family decision." I had driven 4 hours from Chicago to attend what my parents called a family meeting. I thought it was about my father's health. I had canceled the client presentation, booked a hotel, and arrived with a casserole dish because that is what I do. I show up. I have always shown up. The house in question was the one I grew up in, a 4-bedroom Victorian in Naperville that my grandparents had built and my parents had promised me in writing when I turned 22. Not promised in the vague, verbal way families make promises over holiday dinners. Promised in a letter, notarized, signed by both of them and their attorney at the time, stating that upon their eventual passing or decision to transfer property, the house would go to me, their eldest daughter, in recognition of the financial and personal sacrifices I had made caring for the family during my father's first health crisis. I had that letter in a folder in my car. I had driven 4 hours with it. My brother sat across from me at the kitchen table, not quite meeting my eyes. He was 31 and had just declared bankruptcy for the second time, this one related to a food truck venture that had lasted 8 months before the IRS came calling. He was not a bad person. He had never been a bad person. He had simply never been asked to be a responsible one, because there had always been someone else to absorb the consequences of his choices. That someone was usually me. "The transfer is already in process," my father said. He said it the way people say things they have rehearsed. Flat, careful, like reading from a script someone else had written. "The attorney filed the paperwork last week. We wanted to tell you in person last week. The paperwork had been filed last week and they had waited until this weekend, until I was sitting in their kitchen with a casserole to tell me." I looked at my brother. He finally looked back, and what I saw on his face was not guilt. It was something closer to relief, and that was the thing that cracked something open in my chest. "You said the house was mine," I said. "We said a lot of things when we were frightened," my mother replied. "Your father was sick. We weren't thinking clearly. What matters now is that the family stays together and your brother gets back on his feet." "I have the letter," I said, "notarized, signed." My mother's expression did not change. "Letters aren't deeds, sweetheart." I drove back to Chicago that night without touching the casserole. I left it on their counter. I cried somewhere around the Indiana border. Not the ugly kind of crying, but the quiet kind. The kind that happens when something you believe to be true turns out to have been a story you told yourself. I had believed my parents were decent people who had made a promise and intended to keep it. I had built 12 years of financial decisions around that belief. I had not bought property in Chicago because the plan was always the house. I had not taken the London position at my firm 3 years ago because my mother had called me crying, saying she needed me close. I had not done a lot of things. I was a financial analyst. I was 33 years old. I was good at my job, and I had just realized that I had been quietly managed for over a decade by people who loved me in the conditional, bookkeeping kind of way. The kind where your value is tallied against your usefulness and the ledger is never shown to you directly. I did not call a lawyer that night. I had learned, years before, that showing your hand before you have the full picture is how you lose. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea, sat at my kitchen table, and started thinking like an analyst. The first thing I did was pull the county recorder's website. Property transfers are public record. Whatever my parents had filed, whenever they had filed it, it would be there. It took me 40 minutes to find it. The deed transfer had been recorded 11 days ago. The property had been transferred not to my brother directly, but to something called Harlow Family Holdings, LLC, registered in Illinois 6 weeks prior. I had never heard of Harlow Family Holdings. My brother's last name was not Harlow. My last name was not Harlow. I wrote it down and kept going. The registered agent for the LLC was a name I did not recognize. The listed members were 2 people, my father and someone with the initials RP, which I also did not recognize. My brother's name appeared nowhere in the filing. I sat with that for a long time. The next morning, I called my father's longtime attorney, a woman I had met at family dinners for years, who I had genuinely liked, and asked if she was handling the house transfer. There was a pause on the line that told me everything before she said a word. I'm not involved in that matter, she said carefully. Your parents retained separate counsel some months ago for certain transactions. I'm sorry, I can't say more than that. Separate counsel. Some months ago, they had been planning this for months. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I think people assume that when you discover something like this, you go into a kind of dramatic spiral. I did not spiral. I went very still in the way I go, still when a client's numbers don't add up, and I need to find the discrepancy before anyone else notices it. I made a list. I made several lists. I spent the next 3 weeks pulling every public document I could find related to Harlow Family Holdings, to my father's other business interests, to my brother's bankruptcy filings. What I found was not what I expected to find. My brother's bankruptcy had listed my parents as creditors. They had apparently lent him $200,000 over the previous 4 years through a series of personal loans. Those loans were documented. What was also documented, buried in the bankruptcy schedules, was a secured interest in those loans that had been filed against a property, the Naperville House, by Harlow Family Holdings, which my parents controlled, which had been created before my brother's bankruptcy was finalized in a window of time that looked very much like it had been designed to shield an asset from the bankruptcy proceedings. I am a financial analyst. I know what asset shielding looks like. I know what it looks like when someone moves property into an LLC during an active financial proceeding to prevent creditors from reaching it. I know what it looks like, and I was looking at it. But here was the part that made my hands go cold on my keyboard. The LLC documents listed a third member's financial contribution to the initial capitalization, a contribution of $47,000 sourced from a savings account. I recognized the account number. It was mine. It was a joint savings account I had maintained with my parents during my father's illness, set up so that I could cover medical expenses quickly if needed. I had not used it in 2 years. I had assumed it was dormant. I had not closed it because I had not thought about it, because I trusted them. $47,000 of my money had been used to capitalize the LLC that now held the house that was supposed to be mine. I sat in my apartment for a long time after I found that. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone 3 years ago, crying, saying she needed me close. I thought about the London offer I had turned down. I thought about every holiday I had driven home for, every emergency I had shown up for, every casserole I had carried through the door. I did not call my parents. That was the lesson I had taken from every mistake I had ever watched other people make. You do not tell people what you know before you know all of it. And you do not tell them what you are going to do before you have done it. I called a lawyer instead. Not a family friend. A stranger, a woman who specialized in estate litigation and financial fraud, who had been recommended by a colleague and who I reached on a Wednesday afternoon, and who, after I had talked for 45 minutes, said quietly, "This is a RICO-adjacent situation if the bankruptcy element holds up. Do you have documentation for the account withdrawals?" I had documentation for everything. I am a financial analyst. I document things reflexively, the way some people check their locks before bed. I had statements. I had the original notarized letter about the house. I had screenshots of the LLC filings pulled directly from the state database with timestamps. I had the account records. I had emails my father had sent me over the years referencing the house in terms that constituted acknowledgement of the promise. Because he was a man of a certain generation who used email like a paper trail he couldn't imagine anyone would ever use against him. My attorney filed a civil complaint and simultaneously sent a letter to the bankruptcy trustee overseeing my brother's case, flagging the potential fraudulent transfer. That was the move I had not expected her to make, and it was the right one. Because the trustee had authority I did not have, and they moved faster than any civil court would. My parents were informed of the complaint on a Thursday. By Friday morning, my mother was calling me. I did not answer. She left a voicemail that was 15 minutes long and moved through every emotional register I had ever seen her deploy: sorrow, confusion, outrage, victimhood, maternal guilt. It was a masterclass in the kind of emotional performance she had used to manage me my entire life. I listened to it once, saved it to a folder, and did not respond. My father called my office. He told my assistant he was calling about a personal family matter and asked her to have me call back urgently. She passed along the message with a look of professional neutrality that I appreciated. I did not call back. What I did not anticipate was my brother. He showed up at my apartment on a Saturday morning, and I will say this about him: he had not known the full scope of it. I could see that on his face when he stood in my doorway. He had known the house was being transferred. He had not known about my account. He had not known about the LLC structure. He had not known about any of the bankruptcy implications because no one had told him, because he had never been the person in this family who needed to understand the implications of things. He had been the person things were done for, which is not the same as being the person things were done to, but it is also not the same as being innocent. "I didn't know about your savings account," he said. "I swear I didn't know." "I believe you," I said, and I did. "But you knew about the house." He didn't say anything to that. "You knew they had promised it to me," I said. "You knew, and you took it anyway." "I needed help," he said. "I was drowning." "I know you were," I said. "You should have asked me." I closed the door. I did not slam it. I just closed it quietly and stood at my kitchen for a while, listening to the sound of my own breathing. The weeks that followed were not easy in the way that satisfying stories make resolution sound easy. There was nothing cinematic about sitting in a lawyer's office reviewing documents, or refreshing my email waiting for updates from the trustee's office, or lying awake at 3 a.m., recalculating exactly how much of my life I had structured around assumptions that had turned out to be someone else's convenience. My parents, once they understood the scope of the legal exposure, made the first approach through their attorney. They wanted to settle. The offer was the return of my $47,000 and a payment of $80,000 in exchange for my dropping the civil complaint and signing a non-disparagement agreement. I declined. My attorney had advised me that the fraudulent transfer claim, given the timing relative to the bankruptcy filing, was strong, and that the trustee's involvement meant the house was likely to be clawed back into the bankruptcy estate regardless of what I did privately. The settlement offer had told me they knew that too. The offer that came 3 weeks later was different. It included the full transfer of the house to me, the return of my funds with interest, and a payment to cover my legal fees. In exchange, I would not cooperate with any further investigation into the LLC's formation or the source of its capitalization beyond what had already been disclosed. My attorney explained what that meant. There were aspects of the LLC's activities, specifically the way it had been structured to absorb my father's other assets in the period before the bankruptcy, that might attract additional regulatory attention if someone kept looking. They were not asking me to lie. They were asking me to stop looking. I thought about that for a long time. I took the settlement. I want to be honest about that because the version of this story where I turned it down and fought to the last possible consequence is not the version that actually happened. I am 33 years old and I am tired, and I wanted my house and my money back, and I wanted to stop spending my evenings reviewing LLC formation documents. The settlement gave me those things. I signed it on a Tuesday morning in my attorney's office, and I walked out into November air that smelled like exhaust and cold concrete, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment feeling not triumphant and not defeated, but something more like recalibrated. Like a compass that had been running slightly off for a long time and had finally been corrected. My attorney filed the documentation with the court. The house transferred back to me by the end of the month. The funds were returned. I changed the locks on the Naperville property the first weekend of December, driving down on a Saturday with a locksmith and a thermos of coffee and no casserole. I walked through every room. My grandmother's kitchen, where the tiles were original and slightly uneven and always had been. The bedroom that had been mine until I left for college, still painted the pale green I had chosen at 14. The sunroom my grandfather had added in 1987 with his own hands, the windows slightly drafty now, the caulking needing attention. I sat in the sunroom for a long time. My parents and I have not spoken since. That is not a dramatic statement. It is simply a fact about my life now, one I am still in the process of understanding. There are days when it feels like grief. Because it is grief, the ordinary, undramatic kind that comes when you finally stop hoping that people will be different from what they have shown you they are. There are other days when it feels like something closer to relief, though I am still learning how to sit with that without guilt. My brother sent me a text in January. It said, "I'm sorry, I know that's not enough." I did not respond right away. I held the phone and thought about the way he had looked at me in my doorway, the genuine shock on his face when I had told him what had been done in his name. He had not planned it. He had not had to plan it, because for his entire life the plan had been made around him. That is its own kind of damage, and I am not sure whose responsibility it is, but I do not think it is entirely his. I responded 2 weeks later. I said, "I know." That was all. We have not spoken further, but the door is not completely closed, and I am still figuring out what I believe about that. The house needs work, the sunroom caulking, a section of the roof over the back bedroom, the basement waterproofing that my father had been putting off for 6 years. I am getting estimates. I am learning things about Victorian houses that I had never needed to know before and that I find unexpectedly interesting. My grandmother's kitchen tiles are original from 1962 and apparently very fashionable now, which she would have found extremely funny. I think about her sometimes when I am in that kitchen. She was a woman who built things that lasted and who did not have patience for people who moved money around in the dark. I think she would have understood every decision I made. I think she would have told me to change the locks sooner. I moved into the house in February. I drove down from Chicago with my car full of boxes and my best friend in the passenger seat, who had driven 4 hours to help me unpack and who asked no questions and ate terrible pizza with me on the floor of the living room until midnight. That is what family looks like, I think. Not necessarily the people who share your blood or your last name or your kitchen table, but the people who show up with no casserole and no agenda and sit on your floor until midnight when you need them to. I put a small plant on my grandmother's kitchen windowsill the next morning, something that needed tending, something that would grow if I paid attention to it. That felt like the right place to start. I have thought a lot about what made any of this possible. Not the legal outcome, not the settlement, but the whole machinery of it. How a family can dismantle a person so quietly that the person doesn't even notice it happening until they're standing in a kitchen 4 hours from home holding a casserole nobody touched. The answer I keep coming back to is not that my parents were monsters. It would be simpler if they were. What they were was practical in the coldest possible sense of the word. They had looked at their 2 children and made a calculation. One of us had always found a way through. One of us had always absorbed the cost of things without being asked to, and so they had kept asking in ways that didn't always look like asking until the habit of my reliability became something they could budget around. That is what I mean when I say that consequences are not always dramatic. Sometimes the consequence of never asking for anything is that people stop believing you need anything. Sometimes the consequence of always showing up is that your presence gets priced in. I had built 12 years of my life around a promise, and the people who made that promise had simply stopped treating it as binding somewhere along the way, probably so gradually that they had barely noticed themselves doing it. That is how these things work, not with a single decision, but with 100 small ones, each one easier than the last because the one before it had gone unchallenged. What I learned, and I mean learned in the way you learn things that cost you something, not in the way you learn things from a list, is that intelligence without follow-through is just awareness. I had known for years that something was off. I had felt it in the way my mother's calls always arrived at convenient moments, in the way my father's praise was always conditional on my usefulness. I had known and I had not acted on what I knew, because acting on it would have required me to stop being the person they needed me to be. That is not wisdom. That is conflict avoidance dressed up as loyalty. The thing that actually saved me was not courage, it was method. It was the habit of documentation, the refusal to move on a feeling before I had the evidence to support it, the discipline to sit in my kitchen and make lists when what I wanted to do was drive to Naperville and say things I could not take back. Integrity is not just about doing the right thing. It is about doing it in the right order, at the right time, with enough ground under your feet that it actually holds. My brother sent me that text in January and I held it for 2 weeks before I answered. I thought about what it had cost him, not the money, not the house, but growing up in a family that had never required anything of him. That is its own kind of poverty, and I don't know yet what to do with that understanding, but I think sitting with questions you can't fully answer is part of what it means to keep growing. I put a plant on my grandmother's windowsill the morning after I moved in. It needs water and light and attention. So does everything worth keeping.